Now, Alejandro Campos is also very well known to me, and he was a colleague in Delft. He came to Delft as a postdoc researcher on a Marie Curie fellowship, and then taught for a while with us in our group. The fellowship was also on the work of Aldo and Hanni van Eyck, interestingly, and their multiculturalism and ways how they dealt with, let's say, other cultures and other architectures to recharge, re-energize Western modernism. And from that we created actually together a super special project, and it's crazy to say that about your own project, but there was also in this room based on the collections of Aldo and Hanni van Eyck in their house, so the private collections of ethnographica and artworks. We did a little exhibition here called Build Homecoming to rethink collecting and to rethink traveling too, because Aldo and Hanni van Eyck traveled a lot, and also to rethink how the exhibition was first called Traveling Objects, how those objects moved around the earth to come to that house of Aldo and Hanni van Eyck, and were a resource for them to rethink architecture. And then we realized the house itself was also a kind of installation and a tool to work with those objects and to reorder them, rearrange them, and that was part of the exhibition. And that house is being dismantled as we speak. The whole collection will go up for auction. There's another phase in how objects travel and will be dispersed again. So very much relevant, I think, to our topic too, on moving materials. Then Sitara is not here, but I will introduce her when she's here. And then Samia Hanni will have a conversation together with Megan, and I will say a bit more then. All right. So Alejandro, please enlighten us on your research today. What are you doing in terms of coloniality and modern architecture?
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, also Megan. So this project, first I want to say that this project by Megan, I've been like co-applicant with her, and I've been working with her in the topic. And my work is mainly on the work of Aldo and Hanni van Eyck. But lately I've been studying their collection of objects, such as that object that you see there. So I will talk about these objects as moving materials, which is the topic of today's conversation. Okay, I want to start from these two negatives. On the left, we can see an anonymous woman carrying a water vessel. On the right, we see another woman. This time is a named woman. She's Hanni van Eyck, and she's looking through a hole in a fence made of palm leaves. These two images belong to a series of negatives taken during trips to West Africa, and although they remain within unlabeled boxes in the Van Eyck archive, we can pinpoint their location to probably the Sahel region, most likely Niger. The mud brick wall with pointed crenellations is typical of Sahelian architecture, and reed or wattle fences made with palm leaves or woven branches are also typical of the area, used to enclose family compounds and protect gardens. It's not, yes, okay. These two images are not the only photos of fences, walls, and limits that the Van Eycks took during their worldwide travels between the 40s and the 90s. Of course, demarcating place is what architects are trained to do at the end. So it's not strange that Aldo Van Eyck, who is the man behind the camera, showed special curiosity for this kind of architectural devices. As forerunners of the notions of enclosure, thresholds, and the in-between in post-war architecture, the question of the limit of identity at the end was key to transform, for them key to transform modern architecture from a functionalist paradigm to a more humanistic ethos, where notions of culture became central. What I want to do today is to use this particular fixation with fences and walls and limits to argue that these devices are not only an object of curiosity for the Van Eycks, but we can also use them today as an instrument of colonial vision, let's say. And if we think about it, architects' fixation with the limits of things has led them across material and often figurative and epistemic boundaries. It is obvious that architecture demarcates power, after all, and regulates access to places and things. This is why architecture was one of the main participants in the development of colonial empires. In the following presentations, especially Megan's presentation, I think we will hear how through geological documentation, property demarcation, and the construction of infrastructure, territories were to become part of this matrix of extraction. And in this matrix, I think architecture played a relevant role. And the fence, which we can see in this image, I think embodies many of such processes of extraction. What I find most interesting of a fence, however, is the asymmetry, what I call the asymmetry of a fence. No, this is why I wanted to start with these photos, where we can see movement of people and materials across and next to the fence. The Spanish philosopher Santiago Albarrico has written about these asymmetries, the asymmetries of movements across borders and what they tell about the formation of whiteness. One could say that while white bodies freely leap or look through the fence for travel, for field work, for providing expertise, expanding markets, etc., the movements of other bodies face much more friction, are often forced, and bear the consequences of displacement and dispossession. For instance, let's think how easy it is for a Spanish person like me to jump on a plane and land in La Ayoun, which is the capital of Western Sahara. Meanwhile, thousands of Sahrawis, who are also Spanish, live in refugee camps in Algeria, and they waiting there to travel north to risk their life jumping over the Melilla or the Ceuta borders and fences, or even waiting to cross the sea in small boats. What I'm saying is that borders are there to capture and stop only certain bodies. And the asymmetry of a fence, I think, captures the paradoxes of the colonial project, no? This simultaneous fascination with, but also destruction of world cultures. No? The fluidity of some of the movements across fences contrasts with the friction of the very safe movements when they move in the opposite direction. So frictionless extraction vis-a-vis violent displacement. Catherine Yusuf has written that whiteness became established as a right to geography, to take place, to traverse the globe, and to extract from cultural, corporeal, and material registers. When the white body fluidly jumped over the fence, it usually came back to Europe or to North America with hands full of things, no? Gold, phosphate, forced labor, and for my research, what is most important, cultural artifacts. When I first found this photo that I showed of Hanni van Eyck looking through the fence, I was doing research on their use of non-Western artifacts to transform architecture and modernism. That's why I immediately thought of the many stories written by Michel Léry about the famous mission led by Marcel Griol to Southern Sahara. Some of you may know about Marcel Griol. He's an important French ethnographer, which had a big impact on artistic discourses. Griol was the main responsible for the enthusiasm of many artists and architects with Dogon culture, of which, for instance, the Van Eycks wrote several essays. Griol's mission to Africa, which he documented in this magazine, this famous surrealist magazine, also brought back to Europe hundreds of artifacts that now sit on ethnographic museums. Well, Michel Léry, who is a surrealist poet, had joined Griol in his travels, in their relic collecting adventures in the sacred places of Mali. And the nice thing is that he wrote a diary of how they, let's say, they acquired, to say it in a good way, they acquired these objects. And he documented exactly how these objects were collected. These are some parts of the diary. I will not read them, but I mean, you can see there how he speaks of outright theft, no? How they jumped over fences at night to go to the same places they had seen during the day to steal objects from these people. No? So when I saw this image of Hani looking through the fence, I immediately thought of these stories of how these ethnographers jumped over fences to steal things. So I was pointing just now the asymmetries of movements of people across limits, and cultural artifacts like these, ethnographic ritual objects, ancestral textiles, these objects also experience very fluid movements. They were stolen from, or they were acquired also sometimes, at their places of origin, and they were sold in auctions in Europe and the USA. Legui's stories are relevant here because apart from their photos and travels, the Van Eycks also over several decades acquired thousands of these cultural artifacts spanning from Africa to Oceania. Objects that slowly but fluidly moved to their family house in the Netherlands that Dirk was speaking about, where they were displayed as a collection, as you can see in this photo. So this is the Van Eyck's house and part of their collection of artifacts. In other places, I've written about how this collection as a spatialized device was somehow inhabited and enacted by Aldo and Hani, who acted as collectors, curators, visitors, actors, and this allowed them to build a network of actors, practices, and ideas. Yes, the background should be black, sorry. Which makes this a collection that is a reflection of their ideas on world cultures, but also the very same reason these ideas developed. So there's this relationship of using these objects, but also having these objects because you think in a certain way about world cultures. But of course, after these stories by Michel Leris, one needs to ask how and where did they acquire these objects, no? And there's mainly two places where they did so. The first way of acquiring these objects was during their travels. Let's see if it changes. Yes. Every trip for the Van Eycks was an occasion to bring something back. And from the 40s to the 90s, they journeyed across Africa, the Middle East, Asia, South America, etc. Alongside the thousands of photographs that they took, as you saw, they often searched for local shops or dealers where ritual objects and everyday things were being sold. In 2021, I had a conversation with Herman Herzberger about these trips because he joined some of them, and he recalls several travels where he went with Aldo to local art dealerships. He also remembered how when Aldo came back from one of his travels, his lectures were less about their own work and more about these objects and the things they collected. Objects and images from around the world that they wove in stories for the students. Some of these things, as you see, even come with certificates of authenticity because they were interested in these like real objects, not souvenirs, etc. So this tells also something about how they thought of world cultures. And this shows also that they were part of an international market that detaches these objects from their original context and turn them into commodities. In any case, we can say that for the Van Eycks, these objects were ways of carrying the world back home. Sar Ahmed, calls such practices of accumulation as a kind of political economy, a desire to possess that constitutes others not only as objects of desire, but as resources for world making. In a sense, the Van Eycks wanted to bring things home in order to use them to criticize Western discourse. But in doing so, they were also inadvertently, and this is my argument, situated within processes of commodification and exotification of world cultures. Apart from the objects that they bought from their travels, which are the minor part of their collection, there is also a second mode of acquisition. Back in Europe, the Van Eycks were regulars in galleries and auctions, particularly in Amsterdam, Paris, and London. And they visited these ethnographic art galleries, meeting with dealers, curators, and collectors. And of course, these spaces are not neutral. We can see them as nodes in a larger network of displacement and commodification of cultural artifacts. And I use the notion of displacement to connect to where I started with, to forced movements and forced and asymmetric movements through colonial borders. Artifacts reach these galleries, auctions and fairs through complex chains that involve, of course, colonial offices, ethnographers, missionaries, diplomats, and sometimes, as I read, outright theft. In the same way as objects displace, commodify, and transact, their meanings also change when they get to Europe. By the time these objects arrive to European galleries, they are already transformed into artworks or primitive art. A few years ago, I also interviewed Mia Van Boesel, who is the owner of a gallery that the Van Eycks used to visit. She recalled how Aldo Van Eyck would walk into her gallery, pick objects from the shelves, and immediately became the professor. No? As you see here, he started speaking about these objects, their forms, and gave stories to a small circle of people who gather around him. The value of some pieces could even increase based on these improvised talks, showing how the Van Eyck's collecting practices were never really passive. They were actively contributing to the reclassification of these objects as art and to the market dynamics that sustain their circulation. So we can see that the Van Eycks were part of a broader system of collectors at galleries, museums, ethnographers, colonial offices, ports and airports, and of course, borders, by which certain peoples are policed and stopped, and others can travel through, by which certain things cross, acquire new meanings and value as artworks and commodities. A brief example of how things acquire new meanings is this material, the Dogon material, in their collection. Although they did not brought objects from the travels to Mali, the Van Eycks later acquired some Dogon objects. A Kanaga mask, a wooden door, this is called a toguna, which is a column from a men's shelter. They also acquire baskets, like that one in the corner, and pendants. These objects entered the Van Eyck's house as tokens of culture and inspiration for their architectural ideas. For instance, this Dogon basket that you can see in the corner, it became a symbol of the relationship between house, town, city, and universe, which is like one of the main proposals by the Van Eycks in their architectural discourse. What's important to notice is that the source of these interpretations was not Dogon voices. It was the writings of Marcel Griol, the very same ethnographer that spent their days stealing many of such objects. In the 30s, Griol had turned Dogon culture into a European fantasy of timeless harmony. Narratives like these, distorted by colonial frameworks, were widely circulated and reproduced through books, exhibitions, and eventually through architects like the Van Eycks themselves. In a way, these objects had been displaced from their communities and recast into a primitivist history to support their critique of modernism. As you feel, I'm being a bit maybe overly critical of these processes of acquisition, display, and translation. And this is not because the Van Eycks had bad intentions, quite the opposite. In fact, what they were trying to do was to make European modern architecture more inclusive. They were also very publicly against colonial processes and critical of the ways in which world cultures were being received and distorted in Europe. For instance, they were against this notion of primitive art, which at the time was quite popular. But what I want to point out are again the asymmetries of such a displacement of world cultures and the privilege of who talks on behalf of who. Because primitivist discourse, of which I think the Van Eycks were part of, ignores the agency of the original producers of the objects that are articulated into European discourses without their knowledge and willingness. As Aldo Van Eyck himself put it, quite paradoxically, who calls upon a few in the name of all. So far, I've spoken a bit of how the Van Eycks acquired these objects, but we should also try to understand why they did so and what they tried to do with them. Again, Sarah Ahmed, who is an important researcher for my work, reminds us that it is precisely the otherness of things that allows us to do things with them. She writes that when we put certain things within our reach, we extend the reach of our bodies, and we create a particular world around us. For the Van Eycks, collecting was not only a question of possessing or acquiring or admiration, it was a question of world-making. They wanted to use these artifacts to argue that European modernism had become too narrow, mechanistic, too detached from human experience, and too arrogant against the other knowledges and peoples. By gathering these objects in their house, they tried to build a counter-archive to the universalist claims of the international style. In this attempt to expand European modernisms, they used these objects to identify essential human aspects and the ways these were expressed transculturally. By identifying such values, they thought it should be possible to build a more inclusive, more, as they call it, worldly or mondial architecture. So it was a question of this architecture mondial versus the previous international style. This is what they were trying to do. Their collecting must then be seen as a practice that represents but also produces a particular understanding of architecture. This search for essential human aspects, as they call them, was mainly conceptual, connected to their interest in culture and society, in place and occasion, in experience and relativity. However, in their work, those are photos from the orphanage, the most famous building. In their work, we can find a certain formal exoticism, we could say, that I think can only be explained through their admiration for world cultures far from Europe. Paradoxically, this search for a more inclusive architecture, supported on European ethnology and ethnography, and enacting their positioning as Europeans, I think brought them back to universalism, which is a paradox because this is what they were trying to avoid. A universalism that can be seen, I think, very clearly in this famous diagram, which puts all the things, different things from different periods and places, together in service of a universal image or idea of mankind. It was a search for archetypes or universal aesthetic attributes to enrich their own thinking. And the objects could be used for this project because they were first moved, and this is what I want to argue, because they were first moved and then detached from the original context. The Van Eycks spoke of the objects as forms, patterns, evidences of affinities, and universal values. Their otherness made them available to use, let's say, flattening their particularity. But of course, this was not so one-sided. At the same time, they also situated themselves within the discourse of cultural relativism, started by Franz Boas, valuing cultures as autonomous epistemologies that cannot be fully translated. They also used their exploration of world cultures as an opportunity to fiercely criticize their own societal norms and cultural constructs. So we can see actually three approaches at play at the same time, which show the ambivalence of their relationship to world cultures. On the one hand, as I explained, a universalist attempt to reassemble a fragmented reality into a mondial reality, as they said. Then we can also see an introspective use of world cultures as a mirror to criticize and reformulate European agendas and practices, including a fierce critique of imperialism. And we can also see a genuine interest in different cultures in their own terms, what we can call today pluriversality, rather than multiculturalism. Yet, I think, to finish off, I think these are just different ways to articulate whiteness and otherness. In all of these things, what we can see is basically the agency of the collector, of the Van Eycks themselves. They believed that they were opening architecture to other worlds, but in practice they often positioned themselves as mediators, the ones who could cross the fence, bring things back, and make them meaningful in Europe. Even if this gathering of things speaks the language of care, curiosity, and love, which it did, it was still, we can say, violent and creates the framework through which other things do happen. And this brings me to the final slide and to the final fence, which you can see here. In their family house in the Netherlands, the Van Eyck covered their front window with translucent sheets of paper, a different kind of fence. This paper allowed light in, but kept their collection hidden from the outside view. So after decades of leaping fences, crossing borders to bring objects home, they also built out. They built one fence themselves to protect, to obscure, to contain. And I think it's again a paradoxical image. No, it's a gesture of care that speaks about protection, but it also speaks about possession at the same time. So this fence, once again, reminds us, I think, that thresholds are not neutral. They let certain things in, they keep others out, and I think these asymmetries shape the worlds we inhabit. That was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. Yeah, maybe we use the time to unpack it a bit more. I don't know. I don't know if there are for now immediate questions. Questions of clarification, maybe. No. Yeah, sure. That's also possible. Yeah. Yes, I think that's yes. She just arrived, but not here. I think, but she's on her way. So yes, yeah, okay. Or maybe later. There was a question. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Can you explain a little bit about this pluriversalism, the kind of last point that you made? Because I think I found it kind of interesting. Is a kind of topic that is actually currently is kind of a lot discussed, also backed up, by a lot of my own colleagues, basically, as a kind of. I find it very problematic, but I want to hear it from you. Basically, it seems something. I mean, when you kind of read about it, is of course about the idea of the coexistence, but what is the problematic of it? Also, in the kind of context of the work of Van Eyck.
Yes, you mean the pluriversality, yeah. Right? Yes, I read that word myself. It's not a word used by the Van Eycks. They use this idea of mondial architecture, which it's an attempt to include other things, but always into modernist discourse. So that's why I think the agencies of who speaks, who does this inclusion, I think it's important, and this is what I wanted to bring back. But at the same time, they were also very aware of their own position. So, and you can read this in some of the texts. So they were aware of their role as tourists, for instance. They were very critical of tourism, which at the time was not like a normal thing, so because it was very popular. They were very aware of what happens when you use information that does not pertain to your own culture to somehow improve your own culture, and they were aware that this is not so unproblematic, that many misconceptions can happen here. And they were very into this idea of cultural relativism, which I think at the end, the point of cultural relativism is that each culture has to be understood in their own terms. So they were defending this, but at the same time, they were also doing the opposite. That's why I say it's a bit paradoxical, because you can see a really curiosity and appreciation of other cultures, but they are themselves who are speaking about this. And they were really not very political in the sense of fighting publicly for these things. It was more like a self-reflective thing. But still, I think you can see a bit of what today we could call pluriversality. Of course, this comes from the colonial discourse, so how cultural diversity is not the important thing, but cultural difference, and how actually what you need to do is admit that there can be something outside of modernism that cannot be understood and cannot be translated and cannot be included. and they were saying this, but they were doing the opposite thing. So this is why I say it's a bit problematic. But maybe it was, I mean, it's not the right word because they did not use it, but I wanted to bring it here.
Yes,
Was
is
that
it
clear?
okay for now? No?
Maybe we can discuss it.
Okay, yes.
I think they also idolize the other cultures. It's really like the noble savage in a way. So there's a huge adoration for what they encountered, but then there's also.
I think it's also, for me, it's a kind of methodological inherent problem, right? Like how we as architects deal with other things, basically. You know, I mean, the kind of idea of the collecting. It always creates the same kind of problem. You know, it doesn't matter from where or which context, basically. So I think, and for me, it is inherent in the way that some kind of architectural knowledge has been produced, at least in this part of the world, and it keeps so it's, for me, it's a methodological problem at the same time, which creates the same problem constantly. Yeah.
Okay, let's keep that for a later conversation and not dive too much in the discussion right now. So, yeah, Setara just arrived.